when you think of Greenwich, you think of the Royal Naval College and the O2. We're a borough in South East London. We're an outer London borough. But if the initial impression is that we're kind of quite an affluent area, I think actually the borough covers areas of quite a bit of deprivation. So as a population is around 280,000, that's from 2015. I suspect it's probably higher than that now. And from deprivation indices, we came out as having the 50th most deprived borough in the local authority in the country. And that was, I think, maybe is not what people necessarily expect of Greenwich. We have quite a high number of council tenancies, so about 22,000 that are still managed by the council. In terms of challenges in the borough, or challenges, I don't think these are Greenwich specific, but across London, housing is increasingly becoming a massive challenge, and in homelessness. So I've included there some figures there in relation to households in temporary accommodation. There's been some dramatic increases in the last couple of years. It ties into the challenges that are in the borough, or challenges and priorities of the borough really, and they focus around regeneration, but also anti-poverty. So housing, and I think going forward, I think universal credit, that's definitely a challenge that I've been doing what I can to raise awareness in terms for the local authority over what the challenge universal credit will face across the council, not just from a benefits perspective, but I think it's a challenge that I think will have implications for other areas as well. Okay. So in Greenwich, it's quite well established that we provide quite a lot of holistic support, and that's embedded across the council in different areas. So I just thought I'd touch on this to give you a bit of context in terms of how we're set up. So we have a welfare rights service, and that's placed within our housing benefit department. So the department's called Advice and Benefits. We're primarily we've originally were a second tier support service, or still are, and providing training and advice and take up across the borough. But we also have frontline service through a public advice line and frontline advice to residents. The Universal Support Team is also part of the Welfare Rights Service, so that is more specific, targeted support to people on universal credit. And even with changes with the CAB, it's hoped that we'll continue to have some universal support provision within our Welfare Rights Service. And then outside of the department I'm in, we also have other areas of the council that really do incorporate a holistic model. So in housing, we have a welfare reform team which primarily looks at residents affected by the total benefit cap and by under occupancy rules, looking at what a range of support that might be available, not just take up, but looking at rehousing options and employment options and discretionary support. And then Greenwich Local Labour and Business is an arm of the council that's focused on employment. So there's a variety of schemes and routes through that. Having this complement of services means that we are effective in working together with residents. There is a lot of working between the different teams and departments for residents that are affected in the same ways or need help across a range of services. So that's kind of already we work.
And what's the rationale, if I can ask, Corin, what's the rationale for kind of having an in-house welfare rights service? And what difference do you think that makes? Because I think I know we work with a lot of councils and not many, not quite a few actually still sort of retain an in-house welfare rights service. And I've always noticed that about Greenwich, is that's always been quite a big part.
Yeah, I mean, I suspect that the majority of authorities do provide some advice provision, but most probably commission that out to the voluntary and community sector. I would say that the real value in having in-house right is that, particularly from a take-up angle, we have available to us that makes us so much more, our impact can be so much greater. But actually, not just from a take-up point of view, from our general advocacy and assistance for residents, being placed within our, having access to our housing benefit centre means that we can be quite effective in
That's great.
resolving it.
So just to play that back, you've got data available to you, and that you can kind of work arguably a bit more effectively together with those other departments. Just to sort of say, please do slow down a little bit, just because I think the audio is coming in and out.
Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. It's not your fault. Were you going to say something?
I was, but I've forgotten it.
Perfect.
I'll come back.
So moving on, Corin, to how you do take up.
Okay, so historically we have done take up, that's part of the role that we do, and we use our housing benefit data for that. So historically we will do mail shots from who's getting housing benefits, and we'll write out to them and invite them to contact us. So we can do that by targeting certain groups, and it's by doing that. So for the last years we have focused more on pensioner take-up campaigns, particularly over winter periods, and that's been relatively successful. We've had up to around, from mail outs, maybe up to about 10% response rate, and it's very common that we will come across particularly people missing out on pension credits or people missing out on disability benefits. So, and also doing take work in more in other areas, so families with disabled children. So that work is not new to us. We are familiar and used to doing that. So we've been working with policy and practice over the last year, and it's in the last year that we've had the dashboard. And that has really meant that we now have an opportunity to be even more specific in terms of the take-up work that we're doing, and to be much smarter in using the resources and much more targeted, so that we are targeting people where we are much more confident that they're likely to be missing out on benefits, or there is some need there. And I think that, so in the current climate of having to prioritise resources, it's so much more important and valuable for us to show the value of our service and why it's worth to continue to invest in us, because of the results that we can get and the impact that we can make. So with specifically in terms of how we've used the dashboard, so one way in using the dashboard has been in using how you model people based on financial resilience, and then targeting certain groups. So for example, groups that have a debt with the council, or households who are in private rented accommodation and where there's a potential risk of homelessness. And with that being one of the big risk areas within the authority in terms of spiralling costs and impact, it's definitely it's very important for council to do what we can do to try and avoid, if we can avoid eviction further down the line or homelessness further down the line, then that's the business case that we're putting forward from that side. Through drilling down based on financial resilience, we can then look at certain cohorts within that. So we can drill down on households who are maybe just getting ESA only, so we can look at take-up then. So we can see that there is some health condition or disability there, and is there potential to look at whether they can get DLA or PIP, because that can commonly be a benefit that where there is low take-up or people have not been able to make a claim successfully.
Great. I mean, I'll sort of I've switched across to sort of show that opening screen where policy and practice were able to identify around 20 million pounds worth of unclaimed benefits per annum in Greenwich. Juan, do you want to just talk a bit about how the screen came about, or why we were asked to build it?
Yeah, sure. So I think a few of you may have already seen this or seen different parts of the dashboard, but basically, as Corin already touched upon, the sort of fundamental building blocks of all the analytics we provide in the dashboard is housing benefit data. So actually housing benefit data and council tax reduction data, the extracts that we are able to pull out of every local authority on a monthly basis. So we sort of standardize those and we're able to run them through as inputs through our policy modeling tool, which then gives us the ability to, for each individual household, understand not just what benefits they're already receiving according to the data, but what we think they should be eligible for. And that is the sort of the key kind of point here in terms of building this kind of specific benefits take-up screen. Being able to compare eligibility or entitlement to actual receipts of benefits kind of allows you to then sort of strip out, okay, for whom who is eligible but not receiving a particular benefit. And as you can see here, we've been able to do that for DWP benefits. So by that we mean sort of income related benefits or universal credit, sort of tax credits or its equivalent under universal credit, and then perhaps sort of more of more relevance in the current sort of policy climate, the severe disability premium, both under housing benefits and as a part of sort of income related benefits, and who we think is eligible for but not receiving pension credits. And within that we can also identify those that are of mixed age and for whom there is that sort of time constraint before, I think it's May the 16th, if I remember, May the 15th, before they would instead have to make a claim for universal credit. And then we've already touched upon the fact that there are sort of other benefits which are, I suppose, kind of a bit more kind of informal and kind of less likely that a household would know about. So we've kind of listed where we think particular households meet the sort of the basic eligibility criteria for something like the warm homes discount, for free school meals, for a sort of a lower sort of water short tariff or a lower sort of electricity tariff. So yeah, again, for these, we're not able to actually pinpoint which of these are already receiving them because it's not usually reflected in the raw data that we take in, but it's still sort of sifting out those that absolutely will not meet the sort of the base criteria. So it's as good a starting point as possible if you wanted to look at kind of maximizing the income of an individual.
I think what it does do as well is if you identify someone, for example, someone that perhaps isn't getting, it looks like they're not getting the DWP element of the severe disability premium, and they reach out to you, you can then engage with them. And when you engage with them, you don't just do the check on severe disability premium, you do it on all other benefits, including perhaps some of these supplementary benefits as well. So you can help them to not just get one element, but a bit more. Back to you, Corin. Do you want to talk a bit about how you then go out and actually engage residents?
Yep. So with using since using the dashboard from the take up function, so if you go back to the previous screen, I'll just talk a bit about how we've used that, and then I'll lead on to how we've contacted them. With me from a welfare rights background, when this got developed, it was like an early Christmas present, because the power this gives me to be able to identify residents who, from your modelling, have been missing out on certain benefits. It's just such a gift of a tool to enable us to try and to use that data. So what we've done is where it has identified small cohorts, so for example, the SDP group who are not getting housing benefits. So in terms of our approach to take up for some of those groups, we've directly contacted those claimants I would really recommend that if you have officers using this, that ensuring that they've got access to the housing benefit system, because you get the raw information through, or the details through the dashboard. But I think it can be really helpful in having that access to the housing benefit to give you more understanding of the context and the background of that claim. So in terms of groups like the SDP, or what we will do with the mixed age pensioners, we will most likely contact them by phone. When making a decision on that, it's weighing up the numbers and what the financial gain is for them, but we think it's in those areas it's worth putting that resource in to maximise, and particularly where there's a time limit. So for the mixed age pensioners, we've got a deadline in which to support those residents to make sure that they're on the right benefits in that time. So we'll use that option. Where there are larger cohorts, I think we will we'll use the mail out routes. So I think I'm really interested to consider that for those who we have the SDP included in the housing benefit claim, but it's not easy to then track those for us to see whether they're getting that in the DWP benefits. So I think that's an area where I'd do a larger mail shot to households. And then similarly, you talked a bit about free school meals and healthy living vouchers. That's healthy start vouchers. They're areas that as a borough we're quite interested in. So we could either match the data that we get from the dashboard, so for example free school meals, match who you tell us should be entitled against our records of who is receiving it, to do a mail shot to those where they're entitled but not receiving it. But with another option could be healthy start vouchers, would be to mail shot them to encourage them to make the application. Now that might go to a lot of people who are already getting it, but I don't think there's any loss in doing that.
Sort of cover this anyway. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was just going to ask whether you've been able to. I know you've not been using the kind of the take-up screen for that long, but have you been able to sort of do any sort of tracking or kind of keep a record of who you've already sort of sent a mail shot out to or contacted by telephone, and kind of been able to see or kind of spot any patterns in terms of what particular benefits you've had more success in getting people to take up, or what sort of types of approaches for encouraging people to take up those benefits work better than others? Have you been able to kind of track that and kind of see any patterns?
Well, I think with using the dashboard for that take-up work, it's too early for us. So we got the take-up page in early December. And we've primarily been doing small-scale targets since then. So it's too early for me to give feedback on how that's gone so far. I mean, so our previous experience was with mail shots based on housing benefit data, and because that was mainly pensioner take-up, I think that was an easier group to target take-up work at.
I think the benchmark of 10% you mentioned earlier is a good one, and as you sort of said, as we work through it with you, it'll be good to see how our targeted work can increase that, or perhaps get support to different groups of people that perhaps were in the 90% that weren't responding. They're probably the two questions that I look forward to answering with you. And I think the other question is kind of how have other departments made use of the dashboard, or have they sort of reflected positively on your work?
Okay, so I've really been trying to lead to encourage other departments to be interested in using the dashboard, and well, that's basically me giving lots of demonstrations over how useful it is. So as I mentioned earlier, with housing and homelessness being a massive issue for the borough, how we can use the dashboard from early homeless prevention initiatives, there's definitely buy-in to look to see what we can do. And so I think in terms of take-up, there's two types of ways of doing take-up. One is using the take-up screen, so that's like the more kind of conventional view of take-up, which is we see these people are missing out on benefits and ensuring they make the right claims, or targeting people that we can see are missing out on benefits. And I think the other way of using the dashboard with drilling down on households who are at risk in crisis, and then in certain cohorts, it's still take-up work we're doing for those, but it's more wider income maximisation, and then tying that in with other support which we might be able to offer. Because sometimes the support may or may not be income maximisation that we can help with. It might be through looking through employment or other provisions and things like that. So, and I think it's in part by demonstrating that how the dashboard can help with identifying residents who we can provide that holistic offer to. And I think in terms of engagement across the council, so the benefit's going to be different in different departments, but overall it's, so in terms of housing, it was on the, what we can do to minimise the number of people who might come into the door at a future point and present as homelessness. From departments in terms of like the council tax and debt, and debtors, when we've shown the dashboard to them, the angle that they're really interested in is what work can we do for residents who are in debt with the council and who are deemed to be vulnerable. Being at risk in crisis is one way that we might consider whether there's a vulnerability, and then it gives us an option to look at what enforcement action they're taking and whether that can be varied or it can be altered in any way. But also what we're looking to do with that group is then look, can we then provide any support from an income maximisation point of view to try and alleviate the difficulties that they're in. And then the kind of part of the motivation behind that is then hopefully that individual might be in a better place to be able to repay the debts that they have. Employment, again, they are, in terms of the employment schemes, it's got real possibilities with them, and also public health. It ties in with public health in terms of initiatives they run regarding social isolation and supporting residents affected by mental health and health conditions. If you're looking at residents who are, well, when I drill down into the residents who are in crisis, it very often it's single households without any dependents, often without any disabilities. And when I talk to public health colleagues and they talk about the work they're doing about social isolation, I think it's very likely that we're looking at the same people. So it's then looking at what we can do to use the dashboard to tie in, when we're tying in interventions regarding income maximisation and take-up, it's also tying in what interventions or support might be available to target some of those issues in the borough as well. So, I suspect that there are more crossovers that we've not really thought about yet between using the dashboard and then in terms of other priorities across the council.
That's really helpful and fascinating to understand how it can be applied elsewhere and the work you're doing to encourage that. I will run this next poll just to understand how others are taking up campaigns, but we've had a couple of questions too, so perhaps while people are considering it, I'd just like, you mentioned that you'd also showed the dashboard to me yesterday. You mentioned you'd also shown it to DWP. What was their reaction in terms of, in the context of universal credit rollout, both natural and managed migration?
It was very, so I showed them the dashboard yesterday, and when I got to the screen about the impact of universal credit, and it tells you how often I look at the dashboard that I can just quote these figures for you, but it's something like 40% of residents will be worse off in universal credit compared to about 30% that's better off. And showing that to the DWP colleagues kind of demonstrates why I'm so worried about the rollout of universal credit. But they were really impressed with the dashboard. And I was slightly bemused in that. I said, well, primarily this is your data, as in like the housing benefit data is the single housing benefit extract, which we send to them every month. So it's not outside the realms of possibility that they could do this analysis themselves, but they were very interested. We were having discussions over kind of early work they're doing to try and support vulnerable residents or to identify vulnerable residents who would be affected by managed migration in the future. So that was the context of our meeting yesterday.